Hello, and welcome back to the History of the Mongols. I'm your host, Kyle. With the loss of control over the western half of the Mongol Empire, Kublai Khan was left to direct his considerable energies against the single strongest opponent of Mongol rule, the southern Song dynasty, which had dominated China south of the Huai River since the early 1100s. Conquering this dynasty would be no easy task, as it claimed the life of none other than Kublai's predecessor, Grand Khan Mongke, in 1259, as discussed in episode 26. Kublai's greatest accomplishment was to complete the conquest of China. However, first he had to overcome the mighty walls of Xiangyang, which held the key to Song China. As discussed in previous episodes, Kublai was forced to withdraw from his campaign against the Song at the end of 1259, returning to his residence in Inner Mongolia, where he declared himself Khan in the early months of 1260. This sparked a war between Kublai and his brother Arik Bok for the throne, which ended with Arik's surrender in 1264, and Kublai securing his title as Khan of Khans. However, the upheaval of this conflict shattered Mongol imperial unity, and by the mid-12th century, the Mongol Empire had irrevocably split into independent khanates. Kublai had little authority over the western khanates, and his effective power was limited to the Altai Mountains and the Tarim Basin. Unlike previous Khans, whose power bases were in Mongolia, Kublai's legitimacy was tied to his Chinese territory. Aside from his personal interests in Chinese culture, the resources of northern China had enabled him to defeat his brother, Arik. Kublai abandoned Karakoram in Mongolia, which was exposed and difficult to support, and moved his capital south, first to Chengdu, in what is now Inner Mongolia, on the steppes border with China, and then to the site of the former Jin dynasty capital of Zhongdu, where modern Beijing stands. This was Dadu, the great city in Chinese, also known as Khanbalik by Turks, Mongols, and Marco Polo. The indications were clear from the start. Kublai was not only a Mongol emperor, but also Emperor of China. The specifics of this political aspect will be discussed in a future episode. As part of this, Kublai needed to bring the Song dynasty under his control. Kublai, like his brothers, was convinced that the Mongols would eventually dominate the world. It was not a question of whether, but when. Kublai may have projected a more humane image than Genghis or Mongke, but he was still a conqueror. The Song dynasty had to accept Mongol rule or be destroyed, for a man also attempting to overcome his barbarian origins in order to establish himself as China's rightful ruler, having a rival dynasty claiming to be the heirs of the illustrious Han and Tang dynasties posed a significant challenge to his legitimacy in the eyes of many Chinese. Throughout the 13th century, there was a large influx of refugees from North China to the Song dynasty, and any revolt within Kublai's domains could receive Song financial, moral, or military support. Kublai believed that subjugating the Song was absolutely necessary in order to solidify his rule as both a Mongol Khan and a Chinese emperor. The problem was actually doing it. War with the Song began in 1234, months after the Jin dynasty's final defeat. 30 years later, in 1264, the frontier had barely changed. The Mongols ruled territory along the Song's northern and western borders, including Tibet and the Dali Kingdom in Yunnan. Even the northern Vietnamese kingdom of Dai Viet, known in Chinese as Annam, now paid tribute to the Khan. Advances against Song were difficult. Western Sichuan was under a tenuous Mongol hold that had not moved since Mongke's death in the province. The Mongols had discovered that they could easily penetrate the Song border, but holding territory was a different matter. Unlike northern China, which was defined by the relatively open North China Plain, the south was covered in thick forest, mountains, rivers, and canals, with rice paddies and other agricultural activities taking up the available space. This was not the ideal terrain for Mongol cavalry warfare. The humidity and heat became increasingly oppressive as one travelled south, spreading diseases that the Mongols and their horses struggled with. It was also home to the world's largest cities. When Genghis Khan unified the tribes in 1206, the Song capital of Linan, modern Hangzhou, housed well over 1 million people, which was roughly the population of Mongolia. The Song had a regular army of at least 700,000 soldiers, backed up by a large navy. The numerous massive cities built along the Yangzi River could be resupplied by naval forces, an area in which the Mongols lacked experience. Mongke's meticulously planned campaign in 1258 to 1259 resulted in much devastation but little gain, and when the Mongols withdrew at the end of 1259, the Song reoccupied the majority of the lost territory. A military conquest of the Song was a massive undertaking that Kublai wanted to avoid. Soon after declaring himself Khan in 1260, he dispatched an emissary bearing terms. The Song Emperor, Lizong of Song since 1224, could continue to rule as a client of the Khan. They only had to recognise Kublai as the son of heaven to continue ruling, with the usual yearly tribute and prayers in the Khan's name. Kublai saw it as an opportunity for them to enjoy great prosperity, while avoiding the loss of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, as a result of further fighting. Kublai must have considered it a very generous offer, because it did not include extensive retribution as punishment for 30 years of fighting. Kublai's envoy, Hao Qing, a top Chinese advisor, was promptly imprisoned. He would not be released for 15 years. Hao Qing had run afoul of the notorious Jia Sidao, who was now in charge of the southern Song. To some, Sidao was the last intelligent man in Hangzhou, deftly guiding the dynasty against an unstoppable foe, outmaneuvering his foes, and a political mastermind let down by a corrupt and rotten dynasty. To others, Sidao represents the archetypal bad minister, overconfident and inept, downplaying the Mongol threat and concealing the truth from the emperors until it was too late. For some, he is best known as the cricket minister, who enjoyed training insects to fight one another. Sidao's role in the Song's fall is complicated, but his 15-year reign over the Song court resulted in the loss of the last chance to avoid disaster. Jia Sidao, unlike the majority of court officials, did not graduate from the examinations, which were used to select most bureaucrats from the Tang to the Qing. Sidao was born in 1213 to a military family in Zhejiang province. His father, Jia Shi, was a respected Song military commander in Shandong, and Sidao served in a variety of military and civil positions in strategic areas along the Yangzi River. Sidao's fortune was enhanced by his talent and the fact that his sister was Emperor Lizong's favourite consort. Lizong and Sidao did not meet until 1254, when Sidao was the associate administrator of the Bureau of Military Affairs, and they struck up an immediate friendship. Promotions quickly followed. The relationship appears to have been genuine, unlike in the Netflix series where Sidao's rise is attributed to his sister's influence. Sidao's sister died in 1247, leaving Sidao to rise on his own charisma and ability. When Monkey attacked Sichuan in 1258, Sidao returned east following the Khan's death. His timing was fortunate. The removal of the Chancellor of the Right, Ding Daquan, created an opening at the top of the Song court, which Lizong filled with his friend Jia Sidao at the end of 1259. One of Sidao's first acts was to exaggerate Kublai's withdrawal, as if he had won a major victory. Sidao imprisoned Hao Qing, Kublai's envoy, in 1260. Sidao, who became sole chancellor in 1260, wanted to fervently resist the Mongols, which the court agreed with. How to do it was another story. Sidao saw fiscal reform as an important step towards strengthening the dynasty. The war incurred enormous economic costs. A massive standing army, destruction of valuable regions across the frontier, rampant corruption, and hyperinflation of their paper currency placed the Song court in a precarious economic position. Sidao ordered land surveys in 1262 to identify those who avoided paying taxes. In 1263, he stepped it up with his public fields measures, which confiscated excess lands from tax-exempt officials. The government was supposed to buy the land from the owners, but they were mostly paid in increasingly worthless paper money, or the land was simply seized. Sidao hoped to use this land to grow food for the Song army. But his efforts resulted in a large number of Song officials and elite who were hostile to him. Sidao also set up letterboxes where people could anonymously report corruption and official offences. It was a fine sentiment, but it turned out that many of these corrupt officials were also those Sidao disliked. Sidao removed and sometimes executed those who stood in his way, then appointed his own men to their positions. The court was deeply divided, but Sidao was able to overcome this thanks to the emperor's strong support. Lizong died unexpectedly in November 1264 and was succeeded by his 24-year-old nephew, Zhao Qi, also known as Duzong of Song at the temple. If anything, Duzong had a closer relationship with his tutor, Jia Sidao. Duzong was far more interested in extravagant feasts and women than in state affairs, which was not the image of austerity expected when confronted with the Mongol threat, when other lordly men were forced to give up lands and sons for the cause. The new emperor was fiercely loyal to Sidao, and in some depictions, subservient to him. When Sidao considered resigning from the court in 1269, Emperor Duzong fell to his knees, begging and crying for Sidao to return, which Sidao did after dismissing more of his court foes. While this was going on, Sidao was investing heavily in defence, particularly in the Xiangyang region, which we will discuss shortly, as well as improving the capital's walls. Diplomatic efforts with the Mongols had reached an all-time low since the outbreak of war in the 1230s, and despite Kublai Khan's routine release of captured Song merchants and prisoners in an effort to build goodwill, Jia Sidao refused to budge. And because Sidao controlled the Song court and policy, the Song court also refused to budge. Jia Sidao did not launch any major offensives against Kublai during his occupation of Mongolia with a reek, aside from retaking some cities and skirmishing along the borders. Sidao most likely recognised that the Song's defence, with its well-built walls and defensive weapons supported by rivers and ships, could withstand the Mongols' attacks. However, on the offensive, particularly in the more open territory of the north, the Song armies would suffer the same fate as every other northern expedition in the dynasty's 300-year history: a humiliating defeat against cavalry-based armies. Perhaps the most notable attempt to undermine Kublai's rule in northern China was to encourage Li Tan, a Chinese warlord in Shandong who was allied with the Mongols, to revolt. Despite the fact that he and his father, Redcoat warlord Li Quan, had fought the Song for decades, Li Tan did not feel favoured by Kublai. Encouraged by Song promises and Kublai's conflict with Arik, Li Tan declared for the Song in February 1262, overthrowing Mongol rule. It took Mongol forces about a month to arrive and defeat Li Tan's rebels on the battlefield. Li Tan was apprehended in August 1262 and executed. The Song had provided no direct assistance to Li Tan, whose small forces were quickly defeated by Mongolian and Chinese forces led by Shi Tianzi, a northern Chinese whose family had been loyal to the Mongols since the late 1210s. Jia Sidao may have wanted to see if the northern Chinese would rise up against the Mongols, but the Mongol response was swift and violent, putting an end to any talk of rebellion. The rebellion's most significant impact was on Kublai himself. Not only had Li Tan, a Chinese warlord regarded as a loyal subject of the Khan, rebelled, but Li Tan's father-in-law Wang Wentung was also found to be complicit. Wang Wentung was the chief administrator of Kublai's central secretariat and a key figure in Kublai's administration. Executed only weeks after Li Tan's initial revolt, it dealt a blow to Kublai's Chinese support for his government. In the aftermath, Kublai reduced the power of many Chinese officials, replacing them with Central Asians, Muslims, Turks, and Tibetans. Many of the Chinese warlord families who had served the Mongols since Genghis Khan had their holdings reduced or confiscated. Shi Tianzi's family, known for their decades of service to the Mongols, ceased to be feudal lords, owing in part to Tianzi's urging not to lose the Khan's trust. Such was the outcome of Sidao's attempt to undermine Mongol rule in North China. Kublai's first years as Khan were spent consolidating and establishing his northern Chinese governing apparatus, and for the first half of the 1260s, conflict with the Song was limited to border skirmishes. In addition to diplomatic efforts to encourage the Song dynasty's surrender, Kublai offered generous rewards and lands to defectors in order to encourage desertions. Kublai had some successes here, the most notable of which was Liu Zheng, who became one of Kublai's staunchest supporters and a strong advocate for a navy. Liu Zheng and other like-minded men persuaded Kublai that the key was to seize control of the Yangzi River, the backbone of the Song realm and home to the dynasty's most important cities. To accomplish this, the Mongols needed to build a navy and capture the stronghold of Xiangyang. If you look at a topographic map of China, 3 river systems should stand out as they run from west to east. The Yellow River, the northernmost and longest, flows from Tibet's foothills down into the Ordos Desert, where it forms a great loop before cutting across the North China Plain and spilling into the sea near the Shandong Peninsula. To protect themselves from Genghis Khan, the Jin dynasty moved their capital behind this barrier. South of the Yellow River is the Huai, the shortest of the three rivers here, which for a century marked the border between Jin and Song, and is now used as the Mongol-Song border. By Kublai's time, the Mongols had failed to hold it, and the area south of the Huai was a jumble of canals and smaller rivers used for agriculture, unsuitable terrain for cavalry manoeuvres. Our third river on the map is the Yangzi, a wide and fast-flowing river that served as a natural defence against any northern invader. The world's most populous cities were clustered along it, including the Song capital of Hangzhou, located a short distance south of the river's eastern end on the ocean. The Yangzi could only be crossed with difficulty, so the Song used it as a highway to reinforce and resupply cities, ferry troops, and generally prevent a Mongol invasion. Without any beachheads on the Yangzi, the Mongols had no place to build a navy and begin to challenge Song authority, that is, except for the Han River. The Han River flows between the mountains of Sichuan to the west and the end of the Huai River to the east, cutting north to south and intersecting with the Yangzi at what is now Wuhan. The Han was a strategically important access point, allowing the Mongols to secure a river fleet before attacking the Yangzi. Kublai and Jia Sidao were both aware of this, and as a result they spent a lot of money improving the defences of the twin cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng, which are now part of the super city Xiangfang. The two cities, located on opposite sides of the Han River, marked the boundary between the Song dynasty and the Mongol Empire. Xiangyang and Fancheng were both massive, fortified with wide moats, well-stocked, and guarded by large garrisons and a variety of anti-siege weapons. With both cities located on the river, they could be constantly resupplied, preventing the Mongol advance. Liu Zheng and the other Chinese defectors argued that Kublai should abandon the popular Mongol strategy of massive pincer movements. The Song possessed the resources and moral fortitude to withstand these. Instead, the defectors contended Kublai needed to unleash his full force against Xiangyang and Fancheng. Preparations began in the latter half of the 1260s, with the formation of a river fleet. In 1265, the Mongols defeated the Song at Tiaoyu Shan in Sichuan, capturing 146 boats in the process. Koreans, Jurchens, and northern Chinese were assigned to build more ships. In early 1268, officials in Shanxi and Sichuan were directed to construct another 500 vessels. In the final months of 1268, a large force of Mongols, Turks, and northern Chinese converged on Xiangyang and Fancheng. Liu Zheng, a Song defector, was put in charge of the Mongol fleet, which blocked the Han River south of the cities, cutting them off from the Yangzi. Aju, Subadai's grandson, was tasked with the siege of Fancheng, while Shi Tianzi, a Chinese warlord long loyal to the Khans, held overall command outside the walls of Xiangyang. A frontal assault was ruled out. The Mongols' catapults were nearly ineffective against the wide moats and thick walls. Trying to storm the cities would result in significant losses. No, they would have to be starved. To accomplish this, the Mongols built walls and defensive works around the cities, cutting off land access, while Liu Zheng and his fleet kept Song reinforcements from crossing the river. In December 1268, the garrison attempted to break out before the cordon could be tightened, but was repulsed. The Song commander in Xiangyang, Lu Wenhuan, was a steady hand who kept morale high. They constantly probed the Mongol besiegers, looking for any weak points in the lines. Shi Tianzi requested an additional 20,000 reinforcements from Kublai in March 1269 for this reason. The large cities and river access made closing them off a difficult task. While Jia Sidao has frequently been accused of concealing details about the siege of Xiangyang from the Song court, this is a baseless charge. Duzong of Song may have had little interest in military affairs, but it was beyond Jia Sidao's ability to conceal the massive efforts underway outside Xiangyang. Everyone along the Yangzi River would have been aware of it. The court was well aware of the siege. The Song dynasty's annals, the Songshi, describe the court lavishing rewards on the defenders of Xiangyang to encourage their resistance. Even though the how was not agreed upon, the court remained united in its determination to resist Kublai. Sidao dispatched several armies to relieve the defenders, some of which were led by his own brother-in-law, Fan Wenhu. The first of these relief forces sailed up the Han River to Xiangyang in August 1269, but were defeated by the Mongol fleet and had their boats captured. In March 1270, Another attempt by the Xiangyang garrison to break out was foiled, and another Song relief fleet was repulsed. Though the city was largely closed off by the ever-expanding Mongol fortifications at the time, the Mongol commanders required more men. 70,000 men and 5,000 more ships were requested, illustrating the scale of the task to truly surround these cities. Xiangyang was a whirlpool, attracting men from both the Mongol and Song empires, with neither side willing to compromise. Several times in later 1270 and 1271, Sidao's brother-in-law, Fan Wenhu, led fleets up the Han River to assist Xiangyang, and the new Mongol navy triumphed. The skilled Mongol fleet commanders, most notably the Chinese Liu Zheng and Zhang Hongfan, excelled at river warfare, luring the Song into ambushes and developing a long system along the Han to detect approaching fleets and communicate responses. Jia Sidao ordered attacks on Sichuan, the border, and even a naval assault on the Shandong Peninsula. His hopes of diverting Mongol resources were dashed, as the majority of these were inconclusive, won only minor victories, or were outright disasters such as the Shandong attack. Sidao only wasted Song resources while the noose tightened around Xiangyang. Despite the Mongol navy's strong hold on Xiangyang and Fancheng, the cities remained defiant. With a well-stocked army and high morale, any frontal assault would result in heavy losses and may allow the Song to break the siege. In 1272, one relief force made it through to the city, albeit with heavy losses of men and resources. Kublai needed something to end the siege, so he went west to find some news tools. In 1271, Kublai's nephew Abaka ascended to the throne of the Ilkhanate. Abaka, Hulagu's son, continued to recognise Kublai as the nominal head of the empire, unlike his Golden Horde cousins. When Kublai's envoys arrived in 1271, looking for something to help with the siege, Abaka had just the thing. Abaka dispatched 2 Muslim siege engineers, Ismail and Ala al-Din, who were skilled in the latest advancement in projectile weaponry, the counterweight trebuchet. It originated in Europe in the early 13th century and spread to the Crusader kingdoms by the end of the 1250s, where Hulagu may have used them during his campaign in Syria in 1260. They were pretty cool. Instead of using manpower, as the Mongols did with their Chinese catapults, the trebuchet used its counterweight and gravity to hurl projectiles with greater accuracy, power, and range. By the last weeks of 1272, Ismail and Ala al-Din had arrived outside Fancheng's walls and began constructing the machines. In December, the first shots were fired into Fancheng's walls. Within days they were breached, the Mongols occupied the city, and Fancheng was conquered. A massacre of those found within was carried out in full view of Xiangyang's walls. Xiangyang persisted, however. The trebuchets were carefully disassembled before being transported across the river. The weapons were carefully placed in the southeastern corner of Xiangyang during the first few weeks of 1273. The trebuchets were carefully calibrated and reportedly launched a projectile weighing nearly 100 kilograms. The first shot struck a tower along the city walls, resulting in a thunderous crack heard throughout Xiangyang. Panic set in, with Xiangyang's previously impenetrable walls now under serious threat. One of the Mongol commanders, Arik Kaya and Uyghur, rode to the city walls and summoned Lu Wenhuan. He praised Wenhuan for his skillful resistance, but it was time to submit. Do so now, and Kublai will reward him. Resistance would face the same fate as Fancheng. Lu Wenhuan realised there would be no help from the Song for him now. On March 17, 1273, Lu Wenhuan surrendered Xiangyang to the Mongols. After a 5-year siege, the battle was decisively won in favour of the Mongols, and the Han River could now serve as a shipyard for the Mongol advance on the Song. The fall of Xiangyang sent shockwaves throughout the Song Empire. Jia Sidao's authority was severely weakened, but Duzong of Song's faith in him was unshaken. He now needed to plan for a full river and land invasion of the Song heartland. The Mongols kept their promise to Lu Wenhuan, who had sided with the Khan and would now lead the Mongol spear thrust against the Song. Xiangyang was perhaps the decisive victory in the Mongol-Song War, with its fall providing the Mongols with a path to truly conquer the dynasty. The story was so good that Marco Polo retold it several times upon his return to Europe. Either through his own enhancing of the story or that of his ghostwriter Rusticello, the account was shifted to remove the Muslims' role from the siege. Instead, Polo, his father and his uncle taught Kublai about the trebuchet. Given that the siege ended in early 1273, and polo did not arrive in China until 1274 or 5, we can pretty safely dismiss that. However, polo, the Chinese language Yuan Shi compiled around 1370, and Rashid al-Din, writing in Iran in the early 1300s, all mention Kublai obtaining his siege equipment from Westerners. Polo was the only one who indicated it wasn't a Muslim. Kublai Khan was now ready to end the 40-year war with the Song dynasty, completing the conquest of China, begun by Genghis Khan some 60 years before. Please subscribe to our podcast for the next episode, which will look at the fall of the Song dynasty.